The year was 1878, and the silence of the high plains was a living thing. For Hannah Weston, it was the only companion she had left. It filled the small cabin her husband had built with his own hands, seeping into the log walls and the cold floorboards. It sat with her at the rough-hewn table, a constant, heavy presence where Arthur's laughter used to be. Grief, she had learned, was not a fleeting storm but a permanent season, a long winter of the soul that had frozen her heart solid. Her days were etched into a stark and unchanging routine, a bulwark against the tide of memory that threatened to pull her under. She rose before the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose, her movements economical and practiced. She fed the 2 chickens that were her only livestock, their clucking a brief, welcome disruption to the quiet. She tended the small, fenced-in garden where stubborn rows of beans and potatoes fought the arid soil, their green tenacity, a reproach to her own weary resignation. Every task was a prayer whispered to a God she was no longer sure she believed in, a plea for the day to pass without incident, without thought. The cabin stood alone, a tiny, defiant speck in a vast, indifferent landscape. The prairie rolled out in every direction, a sea of grass that rippled and swayed with the ceaseless wind. The wind was another constant, a mournful voice that howled around the eaves at night, like a thing grieving with her. In the distance, the jagged peaks of the mountains clawed at the sky, their stony faces impassive and ancient. It was a beautiful land, a brutal land, and it had taken everything from her. Arthur had seen promise here. He had seen a future. Now, all Hannah saw was the raw earth of his grave, marked by a simple wooden cross she'd carved herself, standing on a low hill overlooking the creek. She had lived in this state of suspended animation for 2 years. The numbness had become her shield. She did not venture into the small, dusty town of redemption unless necessity demanded it. The pity in the eyes of the townsfolk was a thing she could not bear. It was a mirror, reflecting a brokenness she preferred to ignore. The whispers that followed her, poor thing, all alone out there, wonder she hasn't lost her mind, were like stones thrown at her fragile peace. They saw a widow, a victim. They did not see the core of iron that kept her standing, the sheer, stubborn will to simply endure. Survival was the only thing she had left to offer his memory. One afternoon, the oppressive stillness of mid-August was shattered. The air, thick with heat and the smell of dust, was suddenly pierced by the crack of a rifle shot, sharp and ugly. Hannah, who had been on her knees pulling weeds from around her potato plants, froze. Her head snapped up, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. Another shot echoed, closer this time. It was followed by the sound of men's voices, rough and cruel, shouting curses that the wind snatched and tore apart. She scrambled to her feet, wiping dirt from her worn dress with a trembling hand, and peered over the top of her split-rail fence. 2 riders were thundering across the prairie, their horses kicking up plumes of dust. They were white men, dressed in the filthy, trail-worn clothes of drifters or bounty hunters. And they were chasing something, or someone. Then she saw him, a boy, no older than 10, running with the desperate, stumbling gait of pure terror. He was Cheyenne, his dark hair flying behind him, his small body straining with the effort. He glanced back, and in that fleeting moment, Hannah saw the whites of his eyes, wide with a fear so profound it stole her breath. He was just a child. The men were closing the distance, laughing as they spurred their horses on. It was not a pursuit, it was a game to them, a cruel sport. The boy's strength was failing. He tripped, his small form pitching forward into the tall grass not 50 yards from her fence line. He lay still for a moment, a wounded animal trying to disappear into the earth. Something inside Hannah, something long dormant and frozen over, cracked. It was not a thought, it was an instinct, primal and fierce. The image of the boy's terrified face superimposed itself over a fading memory of another child, one she had dreamed of but never held. The stasis that had governed her life for 2 years shattered into 1,000 pieces. She moved without conscious decision, her body propelled by a force she did not recognize as her own. She unlatched the garden gate and ran, her worn boots sinking into the dry soil. "Leave him be," she shouted, her voice raw from disuse. It was thinner than she'd intended, a reed against the vastness of the plains, but it carried. The two men reined in their horses, surprised by her sudden appearance. They were hard-faced and unshaven, their eyes small and mean. The taller one, with a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, spat a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "Well now, Garrett," he said to his companion, a sneer twisting his lips. "Look what we got here, a little prairie hen getting all ruffled." Garrett, a heavier man with a bloated, red face, chuckled. "Mind your own business, lady. We got dealings with this here whelp." "He's on my land," Hannah said, positioning herself between them and the spot where the boy was hiding in the grass. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was steadier now. The fear was real, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a white-hot surge of protective fury. "And I'm telling you to leave him alone." The scarred man, who seemed to be the leader, dismounted slowly. His movements were lazy, arrogant. He walked towards her, his spurs jingling a deathly little song. "Your land? This is God's country, ma'am, and that thing in the grass ain't human enough to deserve a claim to any of it. He's the son of that murdering chief, Awoke, might be worth something. Now step aside." His name was Amos. She would learn it later, but in that moment he was just the embodiment of a casual evil she had only ever read about. Hannah stood her ground. She could feel the boy's fear radiating from the grass behind her, a palpable wave of desperation. She was all he had. "No," she said. The word was small, but it was absolute. It was a wall. Amos's eyes narrowed. The pretense of civility, thin as it was, vanished. "I ain't gonna ask you again." He took another step, reaching a grimy hand out to shove her aside. And then the world exploded. Garrett, still on his horse, had grown impatient. He drew his pistol. There was a deafening bang, a flash of fire and smoke. Hannah felt a searing, unbelievable pain blossom in her left shoulder, as if a hot poker had been driven clean through her. The force of it threw her back a step. She gasped, a choked, wet sound, her hand flying to the wound. It came away slick and dark with her own blood. Through a haze of shock and agony, she saw Amos's stunned face turn towards his partner. "What in the hell did you do that for?" "She wouldn't move," Garrett yelled, his voice shrill. Another bang. A second bullet struck her, this one lower, in the ribs on her right side. A new, deeper agony ripped through her. Her legs buckled. The sky, a brilliant, merciless blue, tilted and spun. Her breath came in ragged, shallow bursts. As she fell, her last conscious thought was of the boy. She had tried. She had stood between. The darkness that claimed her was absolute, a silent, starless void. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a splintered, painful reality. The first thing she registered was pain, a deep, throbbing fire in her shoulder and side that pulsed with every beat of her heart. The second was the smell. It was not the familiar scent of her own cabin, of dried herbs and wood smoke. This was different. The pungent, clean aroma of sage, the earthy smell of leather, and the unfamiliar scent of cooking meat. Hannah forced her eyelids open. They felt impossibly heavy, caked with grit and sleep. The light was dim, filtered through what looked like a translucent animal hide. She was not in her bed. She was lying on a soft pile of buffalo robes inside a structure of poles and skins, a tipi. The realization sent a jolt of alarm through her, a weak current that was quickly overwhelmed by the searing pain of her injuries. She tried to push herself up, but a fresh wave of agony racked her body, and she fell back with a groan that was little more than a whisper of air. "Shh, do not move." The voice was female, low and soothing. Hannah turned her head, a slow, painful effort. A Cheyenne woman knelt beside her, her face a mask of calm concentration. Her hair was woven into 2 long braids, and her hands were stained with herbs. She held a small clay bowl. This must be Mesa, the healer, though Hannah did not know her name then. Mesa dipped her fingers into the bowl and gently applied a cool, fragrant poultice to the burning skin around Hannah's shoulder wound. The relief was immediate, a small mercy in a sea of pain. Beyond the woman, other faces swam in the dim light, shadows and figures. She saw the stoic, unreadable expression of a man who carried himself with immense authority. His face was a landscape of deep lines, his eyes dark and piercing. This was the chief, Awoke, and next to him, peeking from behind his father's leg, was the boy, Hannah. He looked at her not with fear, but with a wide-eyed solemnity that seemed too old for his small face. Guilt and awe warred in his gaze. Fear, cold and sharp, tried to find purchase in Hannah's heart. She was alone, grievously wounded, and in the camp of the very people the men who shot her had called murderers. The town of Redemption was full of stories, dark tales of Cheyenne raids and savagery, but the hands tending to her were gentle. The eyes watching her were not hostile, but filled with a quiet, intense curiosity. The reality of her situation clashed violently with the fictions she had been taught to believe. Days bled into one another in a feverish haze. Her world shrank to the confines of the teepee, to the rhythmic cycle of pain, sleep, and the healer's gentle ministrations. Mesa was a constant presence, her quiet competence, a steadying anchor. She spoke little English, but her actions communicated more than words ever could. She cleaned Hannah's wounds, fed her warm, nourishing broth, and gave her bitter tea that eased the fire of the fever and pulled her into a deep, healing sleep. During her lucid moments, Hannah watched the life of the camp unfold through the open flap of the teepee. She saw children laughing and chasing dogs, women tanning hides or working with porcupine quills, their fingers moving with mesmerizing skill. She heard the low murmur of a language she did not understand, the nicker of horses, the crackle of campfires. It was a world of profound community, of interwoven lives, so starkly different from her own suffocating solitude. The boy, Hannah, became her timid, devoted attendant. He would slip into the teepee and sit silently for hours, just watching her. He brought her things: a cool cup of water, a perfectly ripe wild plum, a feather of startling blue from a jay's wing. One day he pointed to himself. "Hannah," he said, his voice small. Then he pointed to her. Hannah's throat was dry. "Hannah," she rasped. He repeated it carefully. "Ha-na." He then touched his chest, and then hers, a gesture of connection. He pointed outside, mimicking the motion of her standing between him and the riders. He used a Cheyenne word she did not know, but then he found an English one, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You, good." Tears pricked at Hannah's eyes, hot and sharp. It was the first time anyone had offered her an assessment of her character, not her circumstance, in 2 years. It was a simple, profound declaration that undid a knot of loneliness deep inside her. As her strength slowly returned, the chief, Awoke, came to sit with her. He brought with him a younger warrior, Untouchable, whose English was more practiced. For a long time, the chief simply sat in silence, his gaze resting on her, thoughtful and heavy. The silence was not empty, like the one in her cabin. It was full of weight and consideration. Finally, he spoke in his own tongue, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Untouchable translated. "He says his warriors were tracking the white men who stole horses. They heard the gunshots. When they arrived, the men were gone. They found you on the ground. His son was standing over you, holding a rock, trying to guard you." Hannah looked at Hannah, who stood near the entrance, and a wave of warmth spread through her chest, chasing away some of the chill that had lived there for so long. Awoke spoke again, his eyes meeting hers directly. He asks why. "You are not our people. You did not know the boy. Why did you stand for him?" Hannah thought for a long moment, the pain in her side a dull, constant reminder of her choice. How could she explain an act that had sprung not from reason, but from a place deeper than thought. They were going to hurt him, she said finally, her voice still weak. He was alone. No one should have to be alone when they are afraid. The words hung in the air, a simple truth that was the story of her own life. Moketavato translated. A flicker of understanding, of something that looked like respect, passed through Vokin's stoic features. He nodded slowly. He says you have the heart of a warrior, the translator continued. To stand against two men with guns, with no weapon of your own. You bled on your land to protect a son of the people. Our blood and your blood mingled in the dust. Vokin leaned forward, his presence filling the tipi. He spoke his next words directly to her, as if he willed her to understand them without translation. Moketavato's voice followed a moment later, soft and reverent. He says that because of this the council has spoken. You are no longer just the white woman who lives by the creek. You are Sotayo. What does it mean? Hannah whispered. It means shield woman, or she who stands between. It is a name of honor, and with this name comes a decree. You are now a sister to the warriors, under the protection of the Cheyenne nation. Your home is our home to watch over. Your life is our life to guard. You are untouchable. Any who seek to harm you will answer to us all. Hannah stared at him, overwhelmed. Untouchable, a sister. She had sought only to save a child from cruelty, an act of defiance against the bleakness of her own world. She had expected to die for it. Instead, they had given her a name. They had given her a family. The lonely widow of the prairie, pitied and isolated, had been reborn as a protected sister to a nation of warriors. The irony was so profound it bordered on sacred. For the second time in that teepee she wept, but these were not tears of pain or grief. They were tears of a thaw, of a long and bitter winter finally, impossibly, beginning to break. When she was finally strong enough to walk, leaning heavily on a staff Mesa had given her, they brought her home. Vokin himself, along with Moketavato and two other warriors, escorted her. The journey across the prairie was slow, but Hannah saw the land with new eyes. The vast, empty spaces no longer seemed lonely, but filled with a watchful presence. The wind no longer sounded like a lament, but a whisper of names and stories. Her cabin stood just as she had left it, looking small and fragile under the immense sky. But as she stepped across the threshold, the silence that greeted her was different. It was no longer the oppressive, suffocating silence of loss. It was a silence of peace, of sanctuary. The ghosts were still there. Arthur's memory was carved into the very logs of the house, but they were no longer menacing. They had made room for a new spirit, one of resilience and unexpected connection. The warriors did not leave. They made a small, discreet camp on the ridge overlooking her property. They did not intrude, but their presence was a constant, comforting certainty. Sometimes, in the morning, she would find a gift on her doorstep, a brace of rabbits, a bundle of wild onions, or a pouch of the same bitter tea that had fought her fever. It was a silent conversation, a daily affirmation of the bond that had been forged in violence and sealed in kindness. Honyahaka became a regular visitor. He would appear at her fence line, sometimes with a warrior, sometimes alone, and help her with chores that her healing body still found difficult. He would haul water from the creek or help her weed the garden, his childish chatter a mix of Cheyenne and the few English words he was determined to learn from her. She taught him sun and river and potato. He taught her the Cheyenne words for friend and thank you. They built a bridge of language across the gulf of their two worlds, a fragile, sturdy thing made of shared smiles and simple nouns. The grief for Arthur did not vanish. It remained a part of her, an ache in her heart that she knew would never fully fade, but it no longer defined the whole of her existence. It was a room in the house of her soul, not the entire house. She had been a woman hollowed out by loss. Now, something new was growing in the empty spaces. Gratitude, purpose, a strange and wonderful sense of belonging. News of her recovery and her unique situation trickled back to redemption. When she next went to town for flour and salt, the whispers that followed her were different. They were no longer tinged with pity, but with awe, suspicion, and a grudging respect. She was no longer just the poor widow Weston. She was the woman who lived under the protection of the Cheyenne. The woman they called Untouchable. She ignored the stares, her back straighter than it had been in years. She had their judgment before, she could endure it now. Their opinions no longer had the power to wound her. Months passed. The searing heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. Hannah's wounds healed into puckered scars, permanent reminders of the day her life had irrevocably changed. They were not ugly to her, they were a map of her survival, a testament to the fact that she had not hidden from life, but had stood her ground. One crisp afternoon, as she sat on her porch shelling beans, she saw two riders in the distance. Her heart gave a familiar jolt of alarm, but it was quickly tempered. She recognized the horses, the slumped, brutish postures of the men. It was Amos and Garrett Donovan. They were riding the edge of her property line, their intentions a dark cloud on the horizon. Perhaps they had come back to finish what they started, or perhaps they were merely testing the rumors they'd surely heard. Hannah did not move. She did not run for a weapon or hide in her cabin. She simply sat, her hands continuing their steady work, and watched them. Then, on the ridge to the north, a lone figure appeared, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. A Cheyenne warrior on his pinto, holding a lance. It was Tavato. He did not shout or make a threatening gesture. He simply sat his horse and watched, a silent, unmovable sentinel. The two drifters saw him. They reined in their horses, their conversation an unheard murmur on the wind. They looked from the warrior on the ridge to the lone woman on the porch, a woman who was not afraid. They saw the cabin, the garden, the thin curl of smoke from the chimney. They saw not an easy target, but a fortress guarded by an unseen, unbreakable promise. Amos spat on the ground, a gesture of frustrated defeat. He tugged harshly on his reins, turning his horse, and he and his partner rode away, swallowed by the vastness of the prairie from which they had come. They did not look back. Hannah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked up at the ridge. Mokitavato raised a hand in a slow, deliberate gesture of salute, of acknowledgement. Hannah raised her own in return. He was her brother. This was her home. She was Sotayo. She was the shield woman. And for the first time in a long, long time, she felt completely, utterly safe. The sun warmed her face, and the silence that surrounded her was filled not with sorrow, but with the profound and enduring peace of being exactly where she was meant to be.